On this day, Christmas Day, the 25th of December, 1989, Nicolae and Elena Ceausescu are tried and shot, and these are filmed and put out on television that day. Nicolae Ceausescu, he is universally despised, and he's seen as the great big baddie. However, in the 60s and 70s, Nicolae Ceausescu was courted by the Americans, the French, many Westerners, because he was seen as an independent communist. Many thought that he was a progressive, a reformer. And at the beginning, when he first took power, in many ways he was. He sought to distance himself from the Soviet Union. He condemned the Warsaw Bloc invasion of Czechoslovakia during the Prague Spring in 1968. Romania did not involve itself in that. And for many in the West, they thought he was the weak link. The problem is Ceausescu went to North Korea once on a state visit, and he saw what he thought looked awesome. Pyongyang was new because it had been destroyed during the Korean War. The entire city, well, the things he saw, communist, modern, broad avenues, palaces of the people here, there, and everywhere, and a cult of personality for Kim Il-sung, the ruler of North Korea. And at this time, when he went in the early 70s, North Korea was about on the same level, GDP-wise, as South Korea. It was only in the next decade that South Korea would jump far ahead of North Korea. During the 50s and 60s, North Korea was ahead of South Korea. South Korea was a third world tin pot mess from the end of the Korean War up until the 60s. And it was still a military dictatorship up until the 80s. So, back then, in 1972, it wasn't as clear-cut as it is now between North and South. And so when Ceausescu got to North Korea, he was very impressed. And he was obviously, he had very impressionable, because what he did when he went back home is he attempted to create his own version of North Korea in Romania. This was helped by an earthquake that hit Bucharest in the 70s, and it caused a lot of damage, but Nicolae saw this as a new beginning. He was going to build his own Pyongyang in Bucharest. Unfortunately, he destroyed much of the old part of the city to do this, and he then decided he wanted to build his great big palace of the people in Bucharest, which is a gaudy, huge, weird sort of architecturally, a weird pile in the middle of the city. It's enormous, and today it contains the Romanian Parliament, the offices of the President, all the various ministries are in there. It's so big, and yet most of the building is still not used even now, and a lot of it isn't even finished. So it was a big ego thing for Ceausescu. And he wasted a lot of money. He could have just restored the old city, repaired it, maybe 1 or 2 new buildings if he wanted, but he wanted to make his own Pyongyang. And he was also inspired to try to create a cult of personality. So this promising young progressive reformist communist of the 60s became a Kim wannabe in the 70s. And he got worse. He became obsessed as well with paying off the national debt that Romania had. He didn't want to be dependent on Western banks. Always very strange, I find. All these communist countries were heavily in debt to Western banks. I thought we were having a Cold War. Anyway, so he wanted to get off of that debt and he wanted to pay it off. But in doing so, he impoverished the country for like 15 years. Every extra penny was spent on paying down the debt. It wasn't spent on the orphanages. It wasn't spent on health. It wasn't spent on infrastructure, except for his ego trip in Bucharest. And so between the debt and his great big palace and all the boulevards now in Bucharest, all the money was going on that. Almost nothing was going on any, well, security as well. So his ego buildings, his military and his security, and debt repayment. Pretty much nothing else was paid. Romania became grindingly poor throughout the 80s. And at the end of the 80s, something interesting happened. Communism began to fail. First in Poland, then in Hungary, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Bulgaria. But in the summer, there had been something that had happened in China. In June of that year, tens of millions of people had come out and protested in cities around China. The focus, and the one that the world knows most about because there were Western journalists there, was in Beijing, in Tiananmen Square. And for a while, it looked as if communism in China was about to fail. But Deng put his foot down, and he used the violence of the state against these people. And he reasserted communist control in China. And what followed was months, if not years, of crackdowns and tyranny. Ceausescu obviously saw this. And so in late autumn, early spring, when protests started happening in Romania, and it happened because there was a Hungarian Protestant minister who was arrested in Timișoara, protests began in Timișoara. Now, he wasn't inspired by the communists in Czechoslovakia, or Hungary, or Poland, or East Germany who resigned, or in Bulgaria even. He was inspired by the Chinese communists. So he decided, well, they survived, I'm going to survive too. So force was used. This blew up in his face, spectacularly. He was giving a speech in Bucharest, and it was live on television. And suddenly, jeers rang out the back of the crowd, and then movement, and then people started rushing, and they started shouting and booing and jeering he puts his hand up as if to shut them up, and this would have worked even a few months before, but they didn't listen. And you see his face as he looks around, shocked that his people are screaming at him, shouting, jeering, booing, and he doesn't know what to do. He goes back into his palace, wife by his side, and his wife, head of the Communist Party and Deputy Prime Minister, powerful woman in her own right. And both of them don't know what to do. Now, many people say that this was a spontaneous uprising. But what actually happened was the communists in Romania decided Ceausescu needs to go. Many of the politicians who came in after him in the 90s, and even the noughties, and probably still some around now, most of them were former communists. What was the difference between them and Ceausescu? They survived. In many ways, this was an internal coup carried out by communists, disaffected communists, who were sick of him being in charge. They wanted to go. And they saw that this, piggybacking on these protests, was a way for them to achieve power. And people were bored of sitting in boring old Romania where you had bread lines and you couldn't get Gucci or Prada or jet out to the French Riviera for a weekend, or go to Paris to do shopping, and the wives of these fellows like nagging them probably and saying, why can't we do what all these other women do who are married to powerful men? We have to stay here and it's so boring. We can't watch nice TV. So they decided, and they came together, and in conspiracy they decided to get rid of him. Now, it was clever because what they did was they got him and Elena on a helicopter and flew them out to the middle of the countryside. And they were driving around, and they were stopping cars, and they'd take someone's car and they'd drive this way and that way. But they were being reported by these people who had met them on the road. Eventually, they were arrested, and they were brought back to Bucharest. So the communists had achieved total victory now, because they had got the Ceausescus out of their hair, and many of their flunkies had abandoned them because they saw which way it was going. So when they came back to Bucharest, they had no more power. It was gone. It had evaporated within a few days. So, what to do now with this fallen dictator? They could have imprisoned him. They could have put him on a proper trial. What they decided was they needed to cover their tracks. And they needed to eliminate two people who knew everything that was going on. They knew where all the bodies were buried, literally. So on Christmas Day, 1989, a kangaroo court was set up, and within moments they were convicted and then shot. All of it was filmed, and it was put out on TV that day. Now, yes, he was a brutal dictator, but he didn't kill people by himself. He didn't imprison people by himself. He didn't torture people himself. Other people ordered this. Other people carried it out gladly, with vigor. And yet, when they saw which way the wind was going, they, like rats on a sinking ship, jumped and pretended, oh my, the only bad person in Romania were the horrible Ceausescus. So, on this day, they put to rest their most dangerous foe. Like the goat in the desert, the scapegoat, all the blame of all the terror and all the misery of Romania was put on Ceausescu's. Okay, that's it. Have a good Christmas. Enjoy the day, and come back tomorrow for more. Subscribe, like, and leave a comment.